Just before dawn, the storm blew itself out with one last angry roar. It started snowing. A frozen silence settled over the canebrake. Back in the thick timber of the river bottoms, a sharp snapping of frozen limbs could be heard. The tall stalks of wild cane, looking exhausted from the hellish night. They were drooping and bending from the weight of the frozen sleet. I climbed out of the deep gully and listened for my dogs. I couldn't hear them. And just as I started back down the bank, I heard something. I listened. Again, I heard the sound. Papa was watching me. "Can you hear the dogs?" he asked. "No, it's not the dogs," I said, "but I can hear something." "What does it sound like?" he said. "Sounds like someone whooping." Papa and the judge hurried up the bank, and we heard the sound again. It was coming from a different direction. The first time I heard it, I said it was over that way. "It's men from the camp," the judge said. "They're searching for us." So we started whooping. The rescuers or the searchers answered. Their voices came from all directions. The first one to reach us was Mr. Kyle. He looked haggard and tired. He asked if everything was all right. "Yes, we're all right," Papa said, "but the old man has a bad ankle. It looks like we'll have to carry him out." "Your team broke loose and they came to camp about midnight," Mr. Kyle said. "They really spooked us. We were sure something bad had happened. 25 of us have been searching since then." Several men climbed down the bank and went over to Grandpa. They looked at his ankle. One said, "I don't think it's broken, but it sure is a bad sprain." "You're in luck," another one said. "We have one of the best doctors in the state of Texas at our camp, Dr. Charlie Latham. He'll have you fixed up in no time." "Yeah," said another, "and if I know Charlie, he's probably got a small hospital with him." Back in the crowd, I heard another man say, "You mean that Latham fellow who owns those black and tan hounds is a doctor?" "Sure is," another one said, "one of the best." Mr. Kyle asked where my dogs were. I told him that they were treed somewhere. "What do you mean, treed somewhere?" he asked. Papa then explained what happened. With a wide-eyed look on his face, he said, "You mean to tell me that those hounds stayed with a tree in that blizzard?" I just nodded. Looking at me, he said, "Son, I hope they have that coon treed, because you need that one to win the cup. Those 2 Walker hounds caught 3 before the storm came up. Then it got bad. All the hunters came in." The judge spoke up. "I'll always believe that those hounds knew what that boy needed was another coon to win. If you fellows had seen some of the things I've seen these dogs do, you wouldn't believe it." One hunter walked over to the broken snag. "3 out of 1 tree," he said. "No wonder. Look here, that old snag was half full of leaves and grass. Why, it's a regular old den tree." Several of the men walked over. I heard one say, "I've seen this happen before. Remember that big hunt in the Red River bottoms, when the 2 little beagle hounds treed 4 coons in an old hollow snag? They won the championship, too." "I wasn't there, but I remember reading about it," one said. "Say, I don't see Benson," Mr. Kyle said. The men started looking at each other. "He was searching further downriver than the rest of us," one fellow said. "Maybe he didn't hear us shouting." Some of the men climbed up out of the galley and started whooping, and from a distance we heard an answering shout. "He hears us," someone said. "He's coming." Everyone looked relieved. Mr. Benson struck the washout a little way above us. He was breathing hard as if he'd been running. He started talking as soon as he was within hearing distance. "Scared me when I first saw them," he said. "I didn't know what they were. They looked like little white ghosts. I'd never seen anything like it." A hunter grabbed Mr. Benson by the shoulder, shaking him, and said, "Get a hold of yourself, man. What are you talking about?" Mr. Benson now took a deep breath to control himself, and he started in a much calmer voice. "Those 2 hounds," he said, "I found them. They're frozen solid. They're nothing but white ice from the tips of their noses to the ends of their tails." Hearing Mr. Benson's word, I screamed and ran to my father. Everything started whirling around and around, and I felt light as a feather. My knees buckled. I knew no more. Regaining consciousness, I opened my eyes, and I could dimly see the blurry images of the men around me. A hand was shaking me. I could hear my father's voice, but I couldn't understand his words. Little by little, the blackness faded away. My throat was dry and I was terribly thirsty. I asked for some water. Mr. Benson came over. He said, "Son, I'm sorry, truly sorry. I didn't mean it that way. Your dogs are alive. I guess I was just excited, so I'm very sorry." I heard a deep voice say, "That's a hell of a thing to do. Come running in here saying that dogs are frozen solid." Mr. Benson said, "I didn't mean it to sound that way. I said I'm sorry. What more do you want me to do?" A deep voice growled again, "I still think it wasn't a good thing for a man to do." Mr. Kyle took over now. "Let's not have any more of this," he said. "We've got work to do. We've been standing here acting like a bunch of school kids. All this time that old man's been lying there suffering. A couple of you men cut some poles and make a stretcher to carry him." While the men were getting the poles, Papa heated the coonskins again and rewrapped Grandpa's foot. With belts and leather laces from their boots, the hunters made a stretcher. Very gently, they put Grandpa on it. Again, Mr. Kyle took command. "Part of us will start for the camp with him," and he said the others will go after the dogs. "Here, take this gun," Papa said. "I'll go with him." Looking at me, Mr. Kyle said, "Come on, son. I want to see your hounds." Mr. Benson led the way. As soon as we came out of the cane, he said, "We may be able to hear them. They have the coon treed in a black gum tree. You're going to see a sight. Now, I mean a sight. They've walked a ring around that tree clear through the ice and snow. You can see the bare ground." "I wonder why they did that?" someone asked. "I don't know," Mr. Benson replied, "unless they ran in that circle to keep from freezing to death, or to keep the coon in the tree." I figured I knew why my dogs were covered with ice. The coon had probably crossed the river, maybe several times. Old Dan and Little Ann would have followed him. They had come out of the river with their coats dripping wet, and that freezing blast of the blizzard had done the rest. Nearing the tree, we stopped and stared. "Did you ever see anything like that?" Mr. Benson asked. "When I first saw them, I thought they were white wolves." My dogs hadn't seen us when we came up. They were trotting around and around, just as Mr. Benson had said. We could see the path that they had worn down through the ice and snow till the bare black dirt was visible. Like ghostly white shadows, around and around they trotted. In a low voice, someone said, "They know if they'll stop, they'll freeze to death." "That's unbelievable," said Mr. Kyle. "Come on, we must do something quick." With choking sobs, I ran for my dogs. On hearing our approach, they sat down and started bawling treed. I noticed their voices didn't have that solid ring. Their ice-covered tails made a rattling sound as they switched this way and that way on the icy ground. A large fire was built, and standing my dogs close to the warm heat, the gentle hands of the hunters went to work. With handkerchiefs and scarves heated steaming hot, little by little the ice was thawed from their bodies. If they would have ever laid down, someone said, they would have frozen to death. They knew it, another one said. That's why they kept running in that circle. "I can't understand why they stayed with the tree," Mr. Benson said. "I've seen hounds would stay for a tree for a while, but not in a northern blizzard." "Men," Mr. Kyle said, "people have been trying to understand dogs ever since the beginning of time. No one never knows what they do. You can read every day where a dog saved the life of a drowning child or laid down his life for his master. Some people call it loyalty. I don't. I may be wrong, but I call it love, the deepest kind of love." After those words were spoken, a thoughtful silence settled over the men. The mood was broken again by the deep growling voice I had heard back in the washout. "It's a shame that people all over the world can't have that kind of love in their hearts," he said. "There'd be no more wars or slaughter or murder, no greed or selfishness. It'd be the kind of world that God wants us to have. A wonderful world." After all the ice was thawed from my dogs and their coats were dried out, I could see that they were all right. I was happy again and felt good all over. One of the hunters said, "Do you think those hounds are thawed out enough to fight a coon?" "Sure, just run him out of that tree," I said. At the crack of the gun, the coon ran far out on the big limb, stopped. Again the hunter sprinkled him with birdshot. This time he jumped. Hitting the ground, he crouched down. Old Dan made a lunge, and just as he reached him, the coon sprang up and came down on his head. Holding on with his claws, the coon sank his teeth in the long, tender ear. Old Dan was furious. He started turning in a circle, bawling with pain. Little Ann was trying hard to get a hold of the coon, but she couldn't. Because of his fast circling, old Dan's feet flew out from under him and he fell. This gave Little Ann a chance. Darting in, her jaws closed on the back of the coon's neck, and I knew the fight was over. Arriving back at camp, I saw that all the tents had been taken down but ours. A hunter said, "Everyone's in a hurry to get out of here before another storm hits." Papa told me to take the dogs and into the tent as Grandpa wanted to see them. I saw tears in my grandfather's eyes as he talked to them. His ankle was wrapped in bandages. His foot and his toes were swollen to twice their normal size. They had turned a greenish-yellow color. Placing my hands on his foot, I could feel the feverish heat. Dr. Latham came over. "Are you ready to go now?" he asked. Snorting and growling, Grandpa said, "I told you I wasn't going anywhere till I could see the gold cup handed to this boy." Turning to face the crowd, Dr. Latham said, "Men, get this over. I want to get this man to town. That's one of the meanest sprains I've ever seen. It should be in a cast, but I don't have any plaster Paris with me." The hunter who had come by our tent collecting the jackpot money came up to me. He handed me the box and said, "Here you are, son. Over $300 in this box, and it's all yours." Turning to the crowd, he said, "Fellows, I can always say this. On this hunt I have seen 2 of the finest little coon hounds I hope to ever see." There was a roar of approval from the crowd. Looking down, I saw the box was almost full of money. I was shaking all over. I tried to say thanks, but it was only a whisper. Turning, I handed the box to my father. As his rough old hands closed around it, I saw a strange look come over his face. He turned to my dogs. Some of the men started shouting, "Here it is!" The crowd parted, and the judge walked through. I saw the gleaming metal of a gold cup in his hand. After a very short speech, he handed it to me, saying, "Son, this makes me very proud. It's a great honor to present you with this championship cup." The crowd exploded. The hunters' shouts were deafening. I don't know from where those 2 silly old tears came. They just squeezed out. I felt them as they rolled down my cheeks. One dropped on the smooth surface of the cup and splattered. I wiped it away with my sleeve. Turning to my dogs, I knelt down and showed the cup to them. Little Ann licked it. Old Dan just sniffed it and turned his head away. So from here on out, I'm going to just kind of summarize real quick for the rest of this chapter. So they loaded up Grandpa in the car and they got him off to the town, and Billy and Papa had to load up the tent and get their things in their buggy and headed back for home. So they stopped at Grandpa's store on their way because they knew he was going to be gone for a few days to feed the animals. When they got home, they were greeted by a stampede of screaming, laughing girls. Billy gave the silver cup to the 2 older girls and the gold cup to his youngest sister. Mama cried. That night they had a big meal and a celebration, and that's when Papa gave Mama the money. She couldn't believe it, and she said her prayers were answered. That night she brought old Dan and Little Ann heaping plates of food and said a prayer in front of them, kneeling by their doghouse.